Welcome to the SDG Warriors podcast. You're tuning into the episode of the podcast through the lens of a National Geographic Explorer, Mark Kauzlarich, photojournalist and a visual storyteller. The SDG Warriors are a team of passionate student change makers and STEMnists on a mission to meet the global goals by 2030 using the power of STEM and 21CLT embedded in curricula across the globe. I'm Simar Mohanty, team lead and student coordinator for the SDG Warriors, and I'm delighted to welcome an incredible guest, Mark Kauzlarich. Mr. Kauzlarich is a photographer, multimedia reporter, and National Geographic Explorer based in New York. His recent work focuses on isolation and marginalization in the United States, with a special focus on the rural Midwest. He holds a master's in journalism from the University of Missouri and bachelor's degrees in political science and Middle East studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2018, he was a nominee for the Ville de Perpignan Rémi Ochlik Award and a winner of the Magenta Foundation's Flash Forward Award. His work has been exhibited across the United States, including twice at Photoville in 2018. Mr. Mark speaks and reads 2 dialects of Arabic, and his clients include the New York Times, where he interned in 2015, Time, CNN, Reuters, the Weather Channel, the Wall Street Journal, the Zeit, and the Huffington Post. We are beyond honored to have you on our show, Mr. Kauzlarich.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's begin with the questions. What is your current job title? In simple words, what exactly do you do?
So I am a photographer. My job varies depending on the day and what people hire me for. As a photographer, I can do a lot of different assignments. Some days I'm a portrait photographer. Some days I am a photojournalist covering news. Some days I'm a documentary photographer, spending time and trying to capture the essence of somebody's experience in their life. And some days I work for companies that are trying to tell stories about their own jobs and experiences and customers. So my job really varies, but in the most simple terms, I use my curiosity and my camera to tell stories about people's lives and the world around us.
Well, it's great to have a visual storyteller here with us today on this podcast. When did your interest in photography begin?
I became interested in photography when I was a junior in college, and I was big into rock climbing back then. It was my big hobby, and I picked up a camera because I wanted to document my climbing trips that I was going on. And I was really inspired, especially by Jimmy Chin, but a lot of these other climbing photographers. And it's really funny because I don't do that at all anymore. But around that time, there were big protests happening in the city that I was living in. I was attending University of Wisconsin-Madison, Wisconsin in the United States. And there were these big protests over unionization and the state budget. And teachers were coming out to protest and to keep their rights to unionize and collectively bargain. And there were upwards of 250,000 people protesting in the streets of Madison. And I had a camera, and I had just been introduced to the photo editors at the local student newspaper. And I went out one of the first days of the protest and took a photo of the street full of people with our Capitol building in the background. And the student newspaper ran that photo as a poster on the front page of the newspaper. And I believe at the time they were printing something like 14,000 issues of the student newspaper a day. So of course I see that the next day, and I was already kind of hooked. But at the same time, the Arab Spring was going on, and my area of study was not journalism or photography. My area of study was political science and Middle East studies. And so with the experience of covering these protests locally and seeing what was happening in the world at that time, and seeing how these photographers were helping bring the story of the Arab Spring to an international audience, it just all of a sudden made sense that this, I think, was what I really wanted to do. And it took some time to start doing it more and more, but that always stayed in the back of my mind, that experience, all of those things coming together at that one time.
Capturing history, that's great to hear. As students, we are trying to capture what's going on during this pandemic, what's going on during this lockdown. Well, where do you get your creative inspiration from? Is there any other artist or photographer who has inspired your art?
I think especially because in those early days, I did not have any formal education. I did go back to graduate school, mostly so that I could become a better journalist and storyteller, and not necessarily for the photography, although I certainly learned a lot in that regard as well. But because I was self-taught, I really do consider myself inspired by, informed by the photographers that I first was seeing and admiring. And every time I undertake a new project, I try to at least research some photographers who have worked on similar subjects in the past, or worked in a way that might relate to the project that I do. And there's so many of them. I wish I could tell you all of them. I look over at my bookshelves, and I have a couple bookshelves full of photo books, and then there's the photographers that haven't even put out a book that I look at their portfolios online. I think the number one tool that I have, and this kind of goes with that inspiration, is my curiosity. I'm just so interested to learn more and be inspired by more people and be exposed to more experiences and more perspectives. And so there's a number of photographers that do really inspire me, and I think that's partially born out of my curiosity. Lately, I've been working on stories about the rural American experience and the marginalization of these rural populations and their ability to survive without the tools and resources that other parts of the United States have. And so the people that inspire me for these stories are people that have been working on the same topics for 50 years now. People have been photographing these same issues and they haven't improved. And so some of those people are Jim Richardson and Bill Allard, William Albert Allard, who have shot for National Geographic, Danny Wilcox Fraser, and then even more recently, friends of mine like Matt Eich, who is a phenomenal documentary photographer in the United States as well. So, I mean, it's just a combination of being curious, being inspired, and acknowledging that we are building on a history from so many other people before us that we can be informed by, and also adding to, and keeping that in mind as you work.
You mentioned about the rural areas and the work you're doing. You've come a very long way. Can you tell us more about your work?
Yeah, especially for me, I was born in a small town, a rural town in Wisconsin, and my parents live in a town of about 200 people. I grew up in a city, but sort of adjacent to these rural areas, and especially in Wisconsin, it is an agricultural hub for the United States, and actually a large international exporter for dairy products and other things. So I've always been aware of and attuned to a lot of the difficulties faced in rural areas. And I think every person has something that they're interested in or aware of. Even though I live in a large city, I live there because it is easier for me to make a living. But I also am informed by my experiences and my background with these rural places. And I thought it was really important that I try to lend my experience, my passion, and my voice to sort of uplift stories that I thought were not being acknowledged or covered completely. And we've done a better job of it as members of the press, as journalists. we've done a better job of starting to try to uncover these stories, because not all rural experiences in the United States are the same, just like not all rural experiences like you or in any country are going to be the same. I think we need as many voices as we can, lifting up as many stories as possible, and that's just an area that I have a lot of experience in. So I try to take whatever time and money I can from my other jobs. If nobody else is going to send me out there, I'm going to go try to do them myself when I can, because that's what I'm passionate about. And the hope is that eventually other people will care and other people will invest in storytelling in these places and lift these stories up, and maybe invest in my storytelling as well, so we can keep moving those conversations forward.
Using your passion to form connections, to capture those important moments, to form history so that we are more informed and the people of the future can be informed. You truly inspire. We've seen that you travel for a lot of your assignments, separated from friends and family. What keeps you motivated?
Yeah, it can be hard, and it has been occasionally taxing on both myself and my personal relationships. It's also sometimes taxing professionally. Sometimes my editors, who I rely on to call me and ask if I'm available for work, those editors sometimes don't actually remember where I am, because I do travel for jobs. And I think what keeps me motivated in the end is the interactions that I have with the people that I am photographing. There are a lot of people that I am lucky enough to be given the opportunity to see parts of their lives that they might not share with anybody else. People that open their homes and their hearts to me during very difficult moments in their lives sometimes, or sharing things that they were reluctant to share with other people, but they want to talk about because they know that it's important. The motivation is that I feel like I have a huge responsibility, especially if people are giving me the opportunity to see these parts of their lives, that sometimes you have to put your personal life aside for a little bit so that you can take a moment and do right by the people that you're with in that time. And I am lucky now that I am surrounded by people who appreciate the potential magnitude of importance, how powerful the work can be, and they acknowledge that there's a trade-off that you have to make. Just, I think, like in a lot of jobs, there are trade-offs that you have to make. And they see the potential importance of the work and support that, and understand that sometimes I have to put personal life aside. My dad was he's a pastor. He's a Lutheran denomination Christian pastor. And there were times when I was growing up that there would be people that would have a loved one that was sick, or they were dying in the hospital, or someone would pass away. And he was very good about being in my life in a way that I think a lot of other dads might not be able to. He would attend my band concerts when I was in school, and he would chaperone trips, but there were times when other people needed him more than I did. There were times that he was not there in the evenings, or there was one year that he had to leave a birthday of mine to go perform a funeral. And I think being around people that understand we can mean more to the world than we can some days to just the people around us, I think is really important. It's something that I've learned from him, and I'm lucky to have people around me that understand that as well.
Opening their hearts and opening their homes, that is absolutely so powerful. You capture all those special moments for people. Through the eyes of a visual storyteller, what does creativity look like?
To me, it's pretty simple. I think creativity is curiosity. I am maybe not the most visually creative photographer out there. There are a lot of people that are really pushing the bounds of photography and experimenting. A lot of that comes with taking risks, and a lot of those risks come with years of failure before you finally get recognized as somebody doing something important. I come from a very traditional background visually, and I work in a relatively traditional way. I do experiment as much as I can to sort of draw out my inner voice in photography. And so that's where I get creative. I do a lot of what we might consider moody work, where I play with the rain on a windshield or the shadows and on a landscape or the clouds in the sky, and show just enough that you can understand what it looks like. But I try to pay attention a lot of the time when I can to what it feels like. So that's one way that I'm a creative photographer, or I try to be. But I think creativity at the end of the day is all about being curious. And to me, that curiosity has either decided what I am interested in photographing or interested in learning more about, and then photographing. My photography and my creativity is a tool. It's a vehicle so that I can explore these curiosities. And I think that can come out in a lot of different ways. For me, it comes out probably more in the subjects that I explore than it does in the way that I photograph. But I think both creativity and curiosity can look like a lot of different things depending on who you are.
What draws you to a particular scene or a subject as a photographer?
It's who I am as a person that informs what I'm drawn to. It might be rural experiences. It might be religion and culture. My background studying the Middle East, studying Arabic in college. I think we all follow different paths, and on some days or at some points in our lives, we might be more curious about some things than others. And I think that extends to our personal lives as well. I grew up with a grandfather who was interested in old antique pocket watches, and I was as well when I was younger, and then I wasn't so much, and then he passed away and I got interested in them again, and now I'm interested in watches, and I'm interested in guitars, and these things draw us in at certain points in our lives. And I think that extends to the work that we do as photographers. I was really interested in the Middle East, and right now I'm more interested in other things, and it's possible that I'll be drawn to something else. And I think also part of that is the things that we're exposed to at certain parts in our lives. I moved to New York City and suddenly became much more interested in the stories in rural places that I had left behind, for whatever reason. I don't know if that's nostalgia, if I was missing these things. I try to follow whatever my gut and my curiosity tells me. And right now that's been those rural storytelling projects, but also moving to New York, I was exposed to these Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities that I had never seen before, and I thought I'd be really curious to explore that. It's just whatever happens in your life, it's hard to tell why we are drawn to the things we are at certain points in our life, but part of what I try to do is be as open to that as possible, and acknowledge that, maybe if I'm interested in this and I care about it, other people will be too, and then I can start experimenting as a photographer with these curiosities.
Well, rural America, religion, watches, Jews, and the Arab world. You use your curiosity, and you have quite a huge canvas. Using your curiosity to find answers, find meanings to those little moments of life. How do you get to express all those meaningful moments through your photograph?
I think part of it is just being as open to the experience in front of you as possible. I do my best to empathize and understand with the circumstances that I'm photographing. There are plenty of times where I'm photographing communities or experiences that I cannot completely relate to because I am who I am. I am a white male photographer who was born in a smaller city in the Midwestern United States. And so when I go to a town that is predominantly African American, largely impoverished, also maybe rural, but the experiences and the legacies there and the history there is not the same as what I've experienced. And so if I'm trying to express the experiences other people are having, the best that I can do is to be open to learning from them and open to the experience in front of me, and also being open to being corrected, learning while you're there, trying to dispel preconceived notions if you find out that they're wrong. I think all of these things are important. I also try as best as possible to be a part of the community when I can, even in small ways. As a journalist, our job is to not influence the story. We don't want to make an impact that changes the course of the story, because then the story, that if we would continue telling it, it wouldn't be truthful. We would have that impact. But there are times that you have to make decisions about whether or not your actions will impact the story or potentially bring you closer to the people that you're spending time with. And I'll give you two examples from South Dakota. While I was out in South Dakota, I was spending time with a woman who had to travel 2 hours each way 3 times a week for kidney treatment. And if she didn't, she would die. And I wanted to illustrate the toll that this takes on somebody who is already ill and living alone in a remote place, and needing to do this so that she could stay at home in a town that was her home. I think a lot of people would say, why not just move? But this is her home. This is where her ties were, and I wanted to photograph that. But as we were driving up, she was having some chest pains, and didn't seem like it was anything serious, but it wasn't going away when we got to the hospital. So they took her to the emergency room, and she wasn't having a heart attack, but she was still in pain. And they thought, it might just take some time before it went away, but she could not drive herself home. So I photographed her throughout her treatment and her time at the emergency room and her dialysis treatments. And at that point, she was trying to decide how she was going to get home. And I made the decision, and I actually called a mentor of mine who worked for National Geographic as a photographer. And I told him, I'm going to make a decision here that I think is probably not the traditional technical correct decision. And I'm going to drive her home, because I don't want somebody to have to drive up, pick her up, leave her car here, then have to drive her back later in the week, pick up the car. It was just too much of a headache. It was too much of a problem. And I said, I'm going to do what I think is the best thing to do as a human being and not a journalist. And I did that, and I didn't photograph her anymore. Not just because of that, but because I didn't think the photos were really kind of working for the story. But I think doing those kinds of things is what it means to be a human, and also what it would have meant to be a member of the community. And so I did that. The other story that I'll tell you that had less of an impact, but also kind of illustrates the way that I think about these things, access the moments in front of me, is I was at a ranch where they were branding cattle. They have to mark their cattle every year, the new cattle that are born, so that they know who owns what cattle and whether they have the legal right to sell it. And so the community gets together, friends and family, they get together and they kind of have a party. They have to gather up the cattle, and then you have to rope the cattle, drag it, and brand it. But you need somebody on the horse to pull the cattle out. You need two people to help wrestle the cattle and hold it down for the 1 minute it takes to get the job done. And they were a little short-handed one day. And I noticed this, and I had never wrestled a calf before. I didn't know what I was doing, but I watched and I listened and I had somebody teach me. And I did that, not because it would make a huge difference in the story, or it was less of a concern because it wouldn't make a huge difference in the story. But when you're in these communities, you want to contribute. You want to be a part of that. You want to show that you're invested just like they are and that you're a part of the team. And so that's another story where I do these things to access these communities, and it leads me, it might seem silly, but it leads me to expressing a better understanding of what it means to be a part of that community, because people learn that I'm invested in them and not just here for a fleeting moment, and maybe open up a little bit more when they see that I'm trying to be a part of the same experience that they're going through.
I've learned that an objective viewpoint is absolutely vital in history, and starting from an objective viewpoint, an objective perspective, to developing empathy with the people who you're capturing. Is it emotionally draining at times?
Yes, it is, and I think the world of storytelling is really grappling with questions of objectivity and bias right now. I sadly know some journalists who in the last year or so have been prevented from covering stories because of perceived biases from their editors. And sadly, that has meant specifically Black journalists being prevented from covering the new social rights movement that's going on in the United States. Black journalists at newspapers who have been told that because they're Black, they can't be objective about the protests or the Black Lives Matter movement. And personally, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I think it is why we're having these questions, these discussions about objectivity and bias, because I think in anything we do, we're informed by the experiences that we've had. So the empathy that you might have as a Black journalist covering a community that has gone through experiences that you've lived through actually better informs the way that you cover them. Just like me growing up around rural experiences informs my view of the issues that they're facing and how I want to cover them. I think you can do your best to be objective in how you critically evaluate the facts and what's being told to you. But I think that's separate from being a robot that just takes in all information and puts it back out into the world and doesn't critically think about the things that you're being told or seeing. I honestly do believe that we need more journalists with more experiences that have those biases that lead them to be curious and question the world in a different way, and present them in a factual way that is being unimpeachable. Like, you don't want somebody to challenge your findings because of who you are. And if you put the right skills together, the right facts together in a way that people can't challenge, it doesn't matter if you're coming from a background where you might be quote unquote biased, because you have the facts to prove that background. I think the thing that becomes taxing more than anything right now is not the question of objectivity, because we have a responsibility to the truth, and we have a responsibility to our readership, the people that might come across our work. We have a responsibility to be truthful for them. What becomes taxing, I think, right now are two things. One, the attacks on journalists, not just verbally, but physically. Right now, there are protests going on in the United States over another killing of a young Black man at the hands of police, and journalists are being physically assaulted brutally by police there. Add to that the attacks that we're seeing towards journalists, especially challenges to their objectivity, people saying that they're not being objective. That can be really hard when you're out in the field and people don't want to trust you because they've been told that they can't trust journalists. And then the other part of that is the very things that we're covering right now are very difficult, and they always have been. But I think there's so much difficulty in the world right now, so much sadness, and journalists, as part of our job, we want to bring the emotion of these hardships to a larger audience. And to do that, we live through them in some ways. We interact with people who have had such hardships. And so I think the real difficulty, the stress, what wears on you is feeling like you have to put yourself in these places where tragedy is going on because other people need to know what's happening, and not necessarily taking a step back and saying, how can we best take care of ourselves? And that's another conversation that is going on a lot in journalism right now. And in addition to the questions of objectivity and bias and how we can best handle that, is how do we take care of ourselves? In addition to taking care of the people that we are photographing, how can we take care of ourselves so that we can continue to spend time telling these stories? And I think that goes back to your question of the difficulties and the stress of these experiences.
Being part of a situation helps you to express better, helps you to cover better, go deeper into those meanings and express what people actually have to say. Find out those little things and put it into people's minds so that they can visualize what's actually going on. Photojournalists like you actually visualize what is an open mindset and what is being a learner for life. So, what are your thoughts and your takes on the digital manipulation of images?
I hopefully will have a much shorter answer in this, which is that in the world of photojournalism, of strict photojournalism, news photography, documentary photography, what we would call editorial photography, I see absolutely no room for digital manipulation, just because we live in a space where there's already so much distrust towards the news, towards media. I think it's something that, from my perspective, sort of originated in this discussion of fake news in the United States and now has spread globally and is being used to attack journalists globally. And manipulating images is not going to make that any better. I think if there's concerns about privacy or consent or protecting identities of people in vulnerable situations, I think that there are plenty of ways to photograph creatively to dispel some of those concerns and protect people's privacy. Smita Sharma is a phenomenal photographer for National Geographic who has worked on a difficult subject in India, where she needed to protect the privacy of young women and girls who had been in very, very dangerous and traumatic situations. And she was able to do that without digitally manipulating. I know that there are some great photographers out there that are working more in an artistic realm, ways that we can learn from them and their creativity and their digital and physical manipulation of photos. But I think that we need to be very careful about how we present those images, especially if they're images that you can't tell on first glance are digitally manipulated. I think that's the place where things can get especially dangerous, because people may not know that this is happening, whereas some artists are using manipulation in a way that makes it quite obvious. There's definitely room for everything in photography. It just depends on what kind of photography and how it's being presented to the world.
we need more photojournalists like you, keeping it real. You mentioned about the story in India. Have you ever shot in hostile locations? And what were some of the challenges of shooting in remote and hostile locations?
I have worked in what we would consider hostile environments as journalists. It's probably not the environments that people would traditionally think of. I haven't covered conflict. I've never been in a war zone. But I have been lucky enough to go through 2 different hostile environment trainings offered to freelancers, because there's always the potential that some of my work will end up being in those dangerous war zones, but also because more and more we're finding that what would be considered traditional assignments in domestic situations in the United States are becoming violent and hostile. And I have worked in environments like that. I've covered protests that have had police actions on the crowds. I've torn my rotator cuff in my shoulder being tackled by police while doing my job. We've seen, even as recently as January 6th in the United States, things that should theoretically have just been peaceful demonstrations of people voicing their opposition turning into deadly protests. And I am sad to say that I keep a Kevlar, a bulletproof vest underneath my bed, and have that with me on certain assignments. Like when I was covering this most recent United States election, I kept that vest in the trunk of my car in case I got the sense that things might get dangerous and out of hand. And as I mentioned, we've had protests in the United States over the death of George Floyd, and even more protests recently over similar incidents. And I know journalists who have been attacked by protesters, but sadly more frequently been attacked and assaulted by police in the United States. And so we would consider these hostile environments to some extent. I know somebody who was shot with a tear gas canister, which are heavy objects that fly at a pretty fast rate of speed. And tear gas, these chemical irritants, are actually outlawed in international war, and police in the United States use them on their own people. And he was struck by one of these canisters in the back. And honestly, what stopped him from being seriously injured or even potentially killed was the fact that he was wearing one of these vests that took the brunt of the work, or brunt of the force that that was sent with this tear gas canister. So I haven't worked in nearly as dangerous of situations as a lot of my colleagues are. I think it's very brave and heroic, the work that people do. I would not encourage anybody to do these kinds of assignments without proper training and experience. There are many photographers, even recently, who have been killed in these hostile environments, and it's a tragedy. But the sad fact of the matter is that the world can and has been getting, I think, increasingly dangerous, and especially in certain places that we did not previously think were dangerous. And it's sad that myself as a journalist, I have to be potentially prepared for things to get out of hand. I think the real sadness in that is I just don't understand how we got to this point. I talk to somebody like you, and I look at the future, and I hope for the future that people will be better informed and more kind to each other and more curious in ways that are less destructive. And you hope that future generations will not will not behave with the rage and frustration and hatred that it seems we're seeing a lot of right now. My hope is that it's not growing, and that future generations like you will come from the perspective of kindness and openness, and not what we're seeing currently. But I do want to say that I do understand where some of these frustrations are coming from, especially when it comes to social justice movements that have not made the progress that they deserve to have made over the last number of decades. I do not live that frustration, so I can't truly understand it, but I can step back objectively and look and say, it makes sense that people would be so frustrated. I don't think that violence makes sense. I don't like seeing people get hurt, but I try to be empathetic in everything I do, and hope that future generations like you will find the progress that is due to them, without the violence that a lot of people are experiencing right now.
I'm speechless. I could have never imagined what it's actually like. Thank you for sharing this with us, putting your life at risk to get us all those stories, all those moments, history as it happens. This is giving me goosebumps already. I can right now visualize the bravery and the resilience of all the photojournalists out there. What's the most memorable piece of work that you have captured and you are most proud of? Please share the story behind what makes it unique and special.
I think that the most memorable experiences I've had are generally ones that have opened a window into something that I could not have ever expected to experience myself. And it's hard to pick a favorite, partially because I don't want anybody to ever hear that something that I experienced with them was less than someone else's experience that I've shared. Everything is, I think, important in different ways or builds up to something else. I can tell you one of my favorite photographs that I've ever made was of a woman in South Dakota and her two children standing in a field with a storm coming in the background and an abandoned farmstead that was on the land there. And I think it's one of my favorites because it is technically a really great photograph, a beautiful photograph, one that captures a lot of emotion and captures the imagination of people that see that photograph. And so I think in that way it's a successful photograph as well. But part of why it's become so special to me over the last few years is because that family and I have become very close, and she's someone that I speak with a lot. I know her husband well, and I have dinner over at their place a lot when I'm there. Sometimes if I have been working 10 days and I'm just tired and I don't know where to go to make the next photo, I'll just go over to her house and sit on the couch and like play with her dogs or their cats or the lambs that they have in the yard and just take a break. And I know it's a safe place for me to go to relax and let my guard down for a little bit and spend time with people that I really care about. And so in that way, I think that's a special photograph for me. I think one of the more special experiences that I've had photographing that I can tell you about is I was out in South Dakota doing this story about what originally was a story about what was the farthest place in the continental United States. So all the connected states, not counting Alaska and Hawaii, but what was the farthest that you could get from a McDonald's? And I think McDonald's is sort of this iconic American thing that you can find everywhere, all over the world. And so I was doing the story that theoretically was about this place that was one of the farthest from a McDonald's in the United States. And it turned into a story about the struggles that rural places like that place were going through and the kind of connections that they had to each other. And I had heard that there was a gentleman that was from that area who had passed away, and they were having the funeral in a few days. And knowing how connected the community was, I knew that it would be a big event, but I didn't know the family at all. And I didn't know how I was going to potentially capture this, because it is such a difficult, sad moment for the family and for the community. And it's not something that you can just show up with a camera. So I messaged one of his daughters on Facebook. She had her own kids. She was in her 30s, but I messaged her on Facebook and I explained who I was, and I was working on a story on a grant from National Geographic, and I was sorry to hear that her father had passed away. And I wondered if I would be able to talk to her about potentially photographing the funeral. And I called her on the phone after she responded, and we talked, and she acknowledged that she thought it was very important for me to capture that and to have full access to the funeral, to be in the front row with them when they were crying, and when they were carrying the casket out the door. And they had horses with a carriage that took his casket to the family cemetery, and people lowered him in by hand, which is not something that you see traditionally in the United States. And I don't know that there was a single photograph in there that was better or stronger than any others, but I've photographed now probably 7 or 8 funerals in my career, and each time it's different, but this one was particularly profound. Somebody that didn't know me at all and allowed me to capture that. And while I don't necessarily know which photo from that day is the most powerful or the one that means the most to me, I think it might change depending on who's looking at the photograph or how I'm feeling that day. But the experience of having somebody say, yes, I'm going to let you into this very difficult moment in our life because I acknowledge that it's important, not just for us, but for other people. That is incredibly memorable to me and incredibly moving. And I think also incredibly strong for the people that I've photographed. I had a similar situation happen when I was in Mississippi during the pandemic. Somebody that I literally had never spoken to before and only met at the funeral home before the visitation for her mother. She was brave enough and strong enough to acknowledge that there was a value in me photographing, and these things are incredibly memorable experiences.
You touch lives while forming that human connect with the people around you. Are these connections the best part of your job? What else makes your job more rewarding?
I honestly think that it is the human connections that are the most rewarding part of the job. And I wouldn't just say photographically or the time that I'm spending with people alone. I would also say, the connections that I'm making with people like you that are curious about the work that I do, and maybe the people that are listening to this podcast, if you are inspired to follow your curiosity, whether it's in journalism or science, whatever it might be, I really value the fact that my work allows me to connect with people during my assignments, after my assignments, that I might inspire some of that curiosity. I have maybe once a week or once every few weeks, somebody will reach out via email, a young photographer with some questions, or recently somebody asked if I would take on an intern, which I had to sadly tell them that I didn't necessarily have a lot of use for an intern and they might end up being quite bored. But instead of me asking them to do free work for me, could I instead mentor them? Do they have questions? Do they want somebody to look at their portfolio and help them get better, or just talk to them about stories of my experiences so that they can learn? And so my human connections, my personal connections, they might vary in depth, and they might be deeper some days with some people that I'm photographing, or they might be deeper other days with people that I am trying to help mentor. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, they might come through people that are mentoring me. I think for anything, it's the personal connections, whether it's through my photography, after my photography, having a conversation across the globe on Zoom. That's the stuff that gets me really excited, no matter what it is, because I enjoy when I make a great photograph. It's fun, but I don't get joy necessarily from pushing the button on my camera. It's what that photograph means. It's what it represents in that moment in time, or that connection with somebody, and that extends to after I'm done with my camera and I put it down.
Being a learner for life has been a major takeaway for our audience today. So, coming this long way, there must be many learnings. What are, from your adventures, what have been your biggest takeaways or your biggest learnings?
I think the things that I've learned are most important. To constantly be curious is a huge thing for me. I keep running lists of ideas that I have for stories, or just even rough things that I can see a picture in my mind, but I don't necessarily know what the story would be. Something that I am curious to see what it is, but I know that being curious about what something looks like is not enough to justify necessarily doing an entire story. So then I leave that there, and I start thinking about the things that I could, learn from it. Where could I start a story that might end up with the experience of making this photograph? But the other thing I think that I really have learned to do is be as open-minded as possible to the variety of experiences that people are having, because nobody experiences the world in the same way as somebody else, and those experiences might be similar to somebody next door than they would be to somebody around the world. That openness to learning about experiences is really important, and I think that goes hand in hand with the idea of empathy. Being empathetic to the challenges that other people are facing, being a good listener as much as possible, because sometimes, actually a large portion of the time, and I think this is important for the listeners to know, is a large portion of the time I'm not taking photographs. I'm getting to know somebody, I'm listening to them, I'm trying to empathize with them, and sometimes you have to know when the right time is to put the camera down and just listen, or to not intrude on somebody's lives, to give them space to mourn or grieve, to have that human experience. And so I think curiosity and openness go hand in hand with empathy, because the more you learn about other people and their experiences, the more you start to see the similarities to you and the human experience, and less about the differences between you. I think that's a really important thing, not only as a storyteller, but as a human being, to remember that we're all human, and we can learn a lot by just opening up and trying to connect with people emotionally and empathizing with them.
Do you have any photographic plans for the future, and what are you currently working on?
I'm hoping to continue generally working on this idea of community. And personally, I think one of the things that I've missed a lot during the pandemic, I think a lot of people have missed, is this idea of being in community with each other, being around each other and supporting each other when times are tough, and celebrating when things are good. And community can look like a lot of different things in a lot of different places, and it can also play different roles in different people's lives depending on where they are. So in general, I'm researching, looking at topics centered around this idea of community and what it can mean to different people and provide to different people. I'm also continuing to be interested in rural places, but I'm also interested in the questions about agriculture and food resources for the future and their impact on our planet. I think there's a lot of questions about how rural places could potentially be a big help towards fixing issues of climate change, and how we could potentially ensure a better future for those rural places, but for the world, and make sure that we have adequate resources for the world when it comes to food and water and usable land. So there's a lot of things that I'm really interested in, and sometimes all the difference is what is the story that might be the easiest to start tackling at this moment. I'm not sure what that might be. I'm always researching a bunch of different things, and I'll be as curious as you'll be to see what my next story might be that I tackle, because sometimes you just don't know what comes first.
Well, we respect your integrity as a photojournalist as you analyze all those experiences and think about the sustainable future of the rural areas and also the world. What advice would you give to students like us who want to become like you?
My biggest advice would be to be as curious and empathetic as possible. I am helping to teach a class in the US, a class of high school students right now, and that's something that I've really been harping on for them is curiosity is good, and sometimes it's enough to be curious about something and want to do it as a story. Sometimes your curiosity might not be the same as somebody else's, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good story or a bad story. So I would say follow your curiosity while keeping in mind that a good journalist maybe is saying a little bit more about the world than they are about what they're interested in. But follow that curiosity, and then try to live, especially as we're in difficult times, try to live as empathetic of a life as possible, keeping in mind that everybody else is going through their own struggles. They have their own difficulties and feelings, and that we, with our skills, or just we as human beings, can do a little bit to help each other out, help each other through these hardships. It's something that I think I get frustrated that I don't see more empathy towards each other, not just in storytelling. I think storytellers are really trying their best, for the most part, to work with empathy. But I think, to be a good storyteller, you should be a good human first. And that's what I'm really trying to advocate for more people to do, is to be kind to each other, be supportive of each other, think about the ways that you can do whatever it is your goal is, while keeping that in mind.
Well, following your curiosity, that is so powerful. Curiosity driving your passion, self-reflection, being objective at times, to capture history as it happens, to empathizing with your subjects to bring in your unique perspective into your stories. You epitomize what it means to be a lifelong learner. Thank you so much, Mr. Mark, for sharing your insights with our audience.